Part 1. My new job at a secret lab had one rule: never open door 13. The rain hammered against the windows of the old crumbling building as I stood in the dimly lit lobby, clutching my employment contract. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist like living things. The receptionist, a pale woman with hollow eyes, handed me a keycard and a single sheet of paper. Her voice was a whisper, barely audible over the storm outside. "Welcome to Blackwood Research Facility. Your keycard will grant you access to most areas, but there's one rule you must never break. Never open door 13. I nodded, trying to suppress the unease creeping up my spine. The job paid 3 times what I'd made at my last position, and the benefits were unmatched. But as I glanced down at the paper, the words door 13 seemed to pulse faintly, as if written in blood. The lab was a labyrinth of sterile white corridors and heavy steel doors. My supervisor, Dr. Grayson, was a tall, gaunt man with a permanent scowl etched into his face. He led me to my workstation, a small room filled with monitors and strange equipment I didn't recognize. "Your job is simple," he said, his voice cold and detached. "Monitor the readings from the containment units. If anything unusual happens, report it immediately. And remember," he paused, his eyes locking onto mine, "never open door 13. I spent the first few hours familiarizing myself with the equipment. The monitors displayed data from various rooms, each labeled with a number: Room 1, Room 2, Room 3, all the way up to Room 12. But there was no data for Room 13. It was as if it didn't exist. As the night wore on, the storm outside grew louder, and the lab seemed to grow colder. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, trying to shake the feeling that I was being watched. The monitors flickered occasionally, but the readings remained steady. Then, at exactly 2:13 a.m., the lights went out. The emergency lights kicked in, bathing the room in an eerie red glow. My heart pounded as I fumbled for the flashlight on my desk. The monitors were still on, but the readings were going haywire. Room 7's temperature had dropped to freezing. Room 9's pressure readings were off the charts. And Room 12's monitor was completely black. I grabbed the radio and called for Dr. Grayson. Static crackled in response. "Hello? Is anyone there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. No answer. I hesitated, then decided to check the rooms myself. The corridors were silent except for the hum of the emergency lights. As I approached Room 7, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. A cold breeze seeped through the crack, sending shivers down my spine. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was empty, save for a single chair in the center. The walls were covered in strange symbols, etched deep into the metal. The air was so cold I could see my breath. I shone the flashlight around the room, but there was nothing out of the ordinary until I noticed the chair. It was facing the wall, but as I watched, it began to turn slowly, creaking as it moved. My stomach churned as I realized there was no one there to turn it. I backed out of the room and slammed the door shut, my heart racing. The other rooms were just as unsettling. Room 9 was filled with a thick black mist that seemed to pulse and writhe like a living thing. Room 12 was completely empty, but the walls were covered in deep scratches, as if something had been trying to claw its way out. By the time I returned to my workstation, I was drenched in sweat. The monitors were still flickering, but the readings had returned to normal. I collapsed into my chair, trying to calm my nerves. That's when I heard it. A faint knocking coming from somewhere down the hall. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from the direction of door 13. I knew I shouldn't. I knew it was against the rules. But something inside me, curiosity, or maybe something darker, compelled me to investigate. I grabbed the flashlight and followed the sound. The corridor seemed to stretch on forever. the red emergency lights casting long, twisted shadows. The knocking grew louder with every step, echoing in my ears like a heartbeat. Finally, I reached door 13. It was unmarked, just a plain steel door with a keycard reader beside it. The knocking was coming from the other side, rhythmic and relentless. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the keycard. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely a whisper. The knocking stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then a voice, low and guttural like the growl of an animal, spoke from the other side. "Let me out." My blood ran cold. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. The voice came again, louder this time. "Let me out." I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing down the corridor. I didn't stop until I was back in my workstation, the door locked behind me. I sat there, trembling, until the sun rose and the storm passed. When Dr. Grayson arrived the next morning, he found me still at my desk, pale and shaken. "What happened?" he asked, his voice sharp. I told him everything, the strange readings, the empty rooms, the voice behind door 13. His expression darkened as I spoke. "You were warned," he said coldly. "Never open door 13. "But what's behind it?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't answer. Instead, he handed me a new keycard and walked away, leaving me alone with my thoughts. That night, as I sat at my workstation, I couldn't stop thinking about the voice. What was behind door 13, and why was it so desperate to get out? The knocking started again at exactly 2:13 a.m. This time, I didn't investigate. I stayed at my desk, trying to ignore the sound. But as the nights went on, the knocking grew louder, more insistent, and the voice began to whisper my name. "Let me out, Sarah." I didn't know how much longer I could resist. Part 2. The Whispering Shadows. The days blurred together in a haze of exhaustion and fear. Every night, the knocking came, and every night, the voice grew louder, more desperate. It wasn't just a voice anymore. It was a presence, something dark and malevolent that seemed to seep into the very walls of the lab. Dr. Grayson had become increasingly distant, his once cold demeanor now bordering on hostile. He avoided my questions about door 13, and the other staff members refused to even acknowledge its existence. It was as if the entire facility was conspiring to keep me in the dark. But I couldn't let it go. The voice haunted my dreams, whispering promises of freedom and power if only I would open the door. I tried to resist, but the temptation was growing stronger with each passing night. One evening, as I was preparing to leave, I noticed a file folder on my desk that hadn't been there before. It was labeled Project Lazarus. My heart raced as I opened it, revealing a series of documents and photographs. The first page was a memo dated 10 years earlier. Subject, containment breach. Location, room 13, status, critical. The rest of the document was heavily redacted, but one phrase stood out. Subject has demonstrated unprecedented levels of aggression and psychic manipulation. Extreme caution is advised. I flipped through the photographs, my hands trembling. They showed a series of experiments. Human subjects strapped to tables, their faces twisted in agony. The final photo was the most disturbing. A dark, shapeless mass hovering in the center of a room, its form constantly shifting and writhing. The caption read, Subject X13, the entity. I felt a chill run down my spine. Whatever was behind door 13, it wasn't human. That night, the knocking started earlier than usual. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the monitors, but the voice was impossible to block out. "Sarah, you know what I am. You know what I can do. Let me out, and I'll give you everything you've ever wanted." I clenched my fists, trying to resist the pull. But the voice was relentless, its words weaving a web of temptation and fear. "You're trapped here, just like me. Don't you want to be free?" I stood up, my legs moving almost of their own accord. The corridor was darker than usual, the emergency lights flickering ominously. The knocking grew louder as I approached door 13, each strike reverberating through my skull. I stood in front of the door, my keycard in hand. The voice was a low, guttural growl now, filled with a hunger that made my stomach churn. "Open the door, Sarah." I hesitated, my hand trembling. The rational part of my brain screamed at me to stop, to turn back. But the other part, the part that had been worn down by weeks of fear and exhaustion, whispered that maybe, just maybe, the voice was telling the truth. I swiped the keycard. The door hissed open, revealing a darkness so deep it seemed to swallow the light from my flashlight. The air was thick and heavy, filled with a smell like rotting flesh. I took a step forward, my heart pounding in my chest. "That's it. Come closer." The voice was coming from the center of the room. I shone the flashlight ahead, but the beam seemed to dissolve into the darkness. And then I saw it, the entity. It was a mass of shifting shadows, constantly changing shape. One moment a humanoid figure, the next a writhing tangle of tendrils. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, glowed with a malevolent light, fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "You've made the right choice, Sarah," it said, its voice echoing in my mind. I tried to back away, but my body wouldn't obey. The entity reached out, its shadowy form wrapping around me like a cocoon. I felt a cold, slimy sensation as it seeped into my skin, filling me with a darkness that threatened to consume me. And then everything went black. Part 3. The Possession. When I opened my eyes, I was back at my workstation. The monitors were flickering, the readings going haywire again. But something was different. I felt stronger, more alive than I ever had before. The fear that had plagued me for weeks was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating confidence. The entity was inside me. I could feel it, a dark presence lurking in the corners of my mind. It whispered to me, its voice a constant hum in the back of my skull. "You're mine now, Sarah. Together we'll be unstoppable." I didn't resist. The power it gave me was intoxicating. I could feel it coursing through my veins, filling me with a strength I had never known. The next few days passed in a blur. I moved through the lab with a newfound purpose, my every action guided by the entity's whispers. It showed me things. Secrets the lab had tried to bury, experiments that had gone horribly wrong. I learned the truth about Project Lazarus. It had started as an attempt to harness the power of the entity, to use it as a weapon. But the experiments had gone too far, and the entity had broken free of its containment, slaughtering everyone in the lab. The survivors had managed to trap it in room 13, but not before it had infected them with its darkness. Dr. Grayson was one of the survivors. He had been trying to keep the entity contained, but it was growing stronger with each passing day. And now, with me as its host, it was closer than ever to breaking free. The entity's whispers grew more insistent, urging me to take control of the lab, to release it from its prison once and for all. I resisted at first, but the power it offered was too tempting. One night, as I sat at my workstation, I made my decision. I stood up and walked to door 13, the entity's presence filling me with a cold, unshakable resolve. I swiped the keycard and stepped inside, the darkness enveloping me like a second skin. The entity's laughter echoed in my mind as it began to merge with me, its shadowy form dissolving into my body. I felt a surge of power as it took control, my vision blurring as the world around me shifted and twisted. When I opened my eyes, I was no longer in the lab. I was in a vast, empty void, the darkness stretching out in every direction. The entity stood before me, its form shifting and writhing as it spoke. "You've done well, Sarah, but now it's time to fulfill your purpose." I didn't resist. I couldn't. The entity's power was too great, its will too strong, and as it consumed me, I realized the truth. I had never been in control. Part 4. The Awakening. The void was endless, a sea of darkness that stretched out in every direction. I floated in its depths, my mind a swirling chaos of fear and despair. The entity's presence was everywhere, its whispers a constant hum in the back of my skull. "You are mine, Sarah, forever." I tried to fight back, to reclaim some semblance of control, but it was no use. The entity's power was absolute, its will unbreakable. But then, something changed. A faint light appeared in the distance, a tiny pinprick of hope in the endless darkness. I focused on it, my mind reaching out as if to grasp it. The entity's whispers grew louder, more frantic, but I ignored them, my entire being focused on the light. As I drew closer, the light grew brighter, until it filled my vision. And then, with a sudden, blinding flash, I was back in the lab. I was lying on the floor of room 13, the entity's shadowy form writhing above me. It let out a deafening roar, its eyes blazing with fury. "You cannot escape me, Sarah." But I could. I felt a surge of strength as I pushed myself to my feet, the light still burning within me. The entity lunged at me, its form shifting and twisting as it tried to consume me once more. But this time, I was ready. I reached out with my mind, focusing on the light within me. It grew brighter and brighter, until it filled the room, driving back the darkness. The entity let out a final, agonized scream as it was consumed by the light, its form dissolving into nothingness. And then, silence. I collapsed to the floor, my body trembling with exhaustion. The light faded, leaving me alone in the darkness. But I wasn't afraid anymore. Part 5. The Aftermath. The lab was in chaos. The entity's destruction had triggered a chain reaction, causing the facility to collapse in on itself. I barely managed to escape, stumbling out into the cold night air as the building crumbled behind me. Dr. Grayson was waiting for me outside, his face pale and drawn. "What have you done?" he whispered, his voice filled with horror. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The entity was gone, but its presence still lingered in the corners of my mind, a faint whisper that I knew would never fully disappear. I left the lab that night, never to return. But the experience had changed me in ways I couldn't fully understand. I had faced the darkness and survived. But at what cost? The whispers followed me wherever I went, a constant reminder of the power I had unleashed and the price I had paid. And as I walked away from the ruins of Blackwood Research Facility, I couldn't shake the feeling that the entity wasn't truly gone. It was still out there, waiting. And one day, it would return.